everybody. Welcome to Terror Talk with Shannon and Kathy.
Welcome.
Happy belated Mother's Day. It is after Mother's Day, but we wanted to address menacing mothers.
Mothers play a much bigger part in horror than we often give them credit for, even if there's just the essence of how the mother contributed to the character's trauma, psychopathy, and then sometimes she is the focus and other times she's an active role. But I think I don't know if we've ever talked in depth about mothers specifically. We've alluded to it.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know about you, Kathy, but when I was researching this episode and kind of dabbling around in what I thought about it, is that it can be that the mother is the hero and like the nurturing whatever, but still kind of fucked up and scary or whatever, but ends up being the savior. Or it can be that the mother is really the bad guy in the whole thing.
For sure. And one more element that this article that I found called Mommy Dearest, The Changing Face of Maternal Horror. They also, the third category talked about the absent mother.
Right.
Which we know.
Makes sense.
Yeah. In the absence of this person, they, wanted their revenge, especially if we're looking at slashers, because slashers are all about a revenge due to something happening much earlier in time.
Sure.
Right. So yeah, no, I agree. I mean, if we look at, if I were to ask you right now, your two favorite horror mothers, would you be able to just be like, oh, these, or do you have to think about it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, before researching this episode, I think I would have been able to do it really quickly. But since I've been looking at them, I can come up with many now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think any horror fan probably could, yeah.
I think my favorite, she's a hero, she's actually not a villain, is Chris McNeil in The Exorcist. She's, and I think a lot of that has to do with Ellen Burstyn and the way that she built that character.
I do too. I mean, we read the book as well as part of our book club, and I still felt like the mom was pretty interesting and pivotal and a really great character in the book as well. I would probably say like Pamela Voorhees in Friday the 13th is super classic.
She's a good one too.
Not only because of the twist, but because when you get the twist and then you reflect on the whole movie and oh my God, so psychopathic. So
yeah.
And then, you mentioned Mommy Dearest, of course. That's more of a psychological horror and a classic. But
that's right. There's this concept in psychology around like the good enough mother, right? And we talk about the importance of, which now I think in later research, we are also talking about this a little bit more generalized because not everybody grows up with a mother, and that good enough mother in some ways could be another parental or guardian figure, but it really comes from the sense that, when this research was first discussed, it's like, well, the mother carries the child, has the child. There's this different kind of connection.
Primary caregiver, basically.
The primary caregiver. And the root of a lot of these villains and horror is because, well, we didn't have a good enough mother.
Right. And by the way, good enough means you don't have to be perfect. That's why they gave it that moniker, is that what they found in the data is you don't have to be a perfect mother. You don't have to mirror perfectly. You don't have to caregive perfectly. You don't have to nurture perfectly, but you have to be good enough. You have to do it more times out of not. You have to do the XYZ things that get us to the developmental milestones.
Right. So I think that most horror characters, or villains, most villains, there's typically a backstory, right? So if we look at, for example, Michael Myers, right? And if we watch the Rob Zombie version of Halloween, even more so, that's much more of a psychological film.
He got so psyched with it, yep.
He got so psyched with it. And we look at, you mentioned Pamela Voorhees, where she was the overly protective mother, because from what we know, she wasn't psychopathic, or she wasn't, it's a movie, so not that somebody turned psychopathic mid-age, but right. she really didn't have any of that sense of revenge, as far as we know, until her son was killed.
Well, yeah, and you could extrapolate that to one of my other favorites, which is Margaret White, Carrie's mom, White's mom.
Yeah.
Protective. Absolutely. In the book, absolutely working from her own massive trauma in her overprotectiveness, and then ultimately, if you're going down, I'm going down kind of thing, the psychopathy, the cruelty, all of that stuff. Like I would throw her in there too.
Absolutely. And I think at the root of all of it is whatever type of mother we're talking about, their motivation tends to centralize around, even if it's in their version of it, protecting their child, right? And so literally, I will kill for my child, or I have done something or contributed to the fucked upness of my child in some way, but all coming from like their own trauma. So like Shannon was just talking about talking about Carrie and that mother was clearly psychotic, but in her mind, she was protecting Carrie.
Oh my God, yes.
Right.
Because of her own trauma and knowing that and believing that, you have to act a certain way or you are going to die, be taken advantage of, be a horrible person, like all the things. Like it's just, she completely believed that.
I would say that horror movies, the mothers in horror movies, is really centered around intergenerational trauma, right? The mothers have all had their own shit and how that gets handed down. We see less of that with fathers. We usually see, if the father is the villain, the child ends up being more of a victim most of the time, not all the time.
Yeah, and the father, it's like something's happened to the father in real time, 10 minutes ago.
That's right. So I'm going to read just a couple quick paragraphs here from this article called Mommy Dearest, The Changing Face of Maternal Horror Cinema. Words by Leela Latif. So she says, mothers in horror films tend to fall in two camps, the most prevalent being the evil shrew, who through her abusive parenting creates the evil antagonist. So we talked about Carrie, The Brood, Friday the 13th, Psycho, Brain Dead. This is normally accompanied by strong Oedipal undertones. Okay, so this is where we're kind of joking about like the psychoanalysis piece. So, if we're looking at this from like a Freudian, the son is essentially wanting to devour the father and protect his mother. He's in love with his mother at this certain psychosexual state of development. So this strong Oedipal undertone. So the second is the screaming victim who is oblivious to what's going on and suffers intensely while being largely incapable of saving herself. And so we see that in The Shining with Shelley Duvall. We see that Chris McNeil in The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, Mia Farrow, and The Omen. That's all very true of kind of like this woman who's under so much distress, and the child is, well, The Omen, it was the devil, but in most of these movies,
of course,
these children then end up suffering. So The Shining is probably the most egregious example of this. Wendy Torrance's apparent obliviousness to her situation. An inability to protect herself or her child is a disheartening portrayal. So I think that's really true too, is if we're seeing this from like the child's POV, the mother's inability to protect herself and the child from, in this scenario, the evil father, what that can do to a child long term. And that almost comes from like roots of domestic violence. So a lot of the tropes of mothers in horror are deeply psychoanalytical. As Stephen King once put it, she is one of the most misogynistic characters ever put on film. And she's basically just there to scream and be stupid.
Yeah.
We're talking about Shelley Duvall in The Shining.
Yeah, those are those like ineffectual moms, the mentally ill moms that affect you but aren't doing it in any kind of mindful way. Like they're not trying to hurt you. They're just like...
They have no emotional regulation.
Completely
They're
incapable.
Incredibly emotionally stunted and can't self-regulate. So what does that do to a child? Is the child learns in crisis to react to that crisis because they've never learned how to take care of themselves.
Yeah, that internalized anxiety.
And we see that in the Babadook too, right? So, and then she goes on to say the slasher genre took this a step further with the prevalence of absent mothers, which is what I was talking about at the beginning. A mother's absence looms large in A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and Scream, both in the life of the protagonists, and when, plot twist, it turns out to be that the gory events were set up by the mother's actions in the first place. So we know in Scream, Neve Campbell's character, Sidney Prescott, essentially is being hunted because they pinned her mother to be a whore. Right? So Nev Campbell, Sidney Prescott, that's all that's happening to her because, literally, I didn't even know that was the sentence, because her mother was a whore. So they were saying the same thing I was saying.
I'll jump in super quick and say, like, on my list, I put Mrs. Loomis, like Laurie Metcalf in Scream 2 as one of my favorite sort of bad moms.
She's a good
Menacing mothers.
Yeah, no, she was good and created, obviously, a psychopath of her son.
So good.
Yeah. And, goes on to talk about the Babadook. And I think it also talks about, and this goes back to the intergenerational trauma, but how levels of mental illness in mothers, like chronic depression.
Oh my God. Yes, absolutely.
How that could turn someone, a child, how that ends up being manifested. Mm-hmm. And I think we see that a lot in films where the mother was kind of this inverted, depressed, unavailable type. Mm-hmm. And we'll see that often in like these flashbacks where like the mother just could not be present.
Well, and that's where we see, the impact on the child is that they don't get the early mirroring. And so there's maybe a narcissistic thing that develops, or they don't get the knowledge of, regulation and analyzing your problems. And they don't go into that developmental stage of like learning how to discern, the trust, distrust, the different things that you need to discern in others and all the different things. Like there's no mom guiding that. Those kids are just watching. Those kids are just trying to get their mother's attention.
Absolutely.
So then they just try to get everybody's attention.
That's right.
Forever.
That's right. Really sad, actually.
It's very sad.
I think the article also goes on to talk about where we have also seen some of these very slight changes. Mm-hmm. So for example, Emily Blunt's character in A Quiet Place is probably, and again, she was a protagonist, so she wasn't the villain here, but as much as she suffers, like literally suffers in silence, mm-hmm. She is not a victim.
No,
she's incredibly driven, assertive. She mourns losses without falling apart. She's flipping pregnant in the movie and having a baby. It turns motherhood actually into a superpower.
Totally.
And I think that we're starting to see that more in horror films, mm-hmm. where like the woman, whether she's a mother or a daughter, it isn't like the worst card you could be dealt. If anything, it shows the amount of resilience it takes
absolutely
to overcome something like grief, loss. When a wife loses her husband and they have children, or loses their spouse and they have children, she has to go on.
Yeah.
And I think historically women have done that, but mm-hmm. historically men have also written horror films.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean? Because if we look even back, like outside of horror, and we look at movies like Steel Magnolias and all that back in the day, the whole idea why those movies and those scripts were made was to prove that women do tend to rely on one another in like a tribal way, pick up the pieces and move on. Mm-hmm. And you oftentimes find that, the men are the ones that are going, I don't know what to do without the mother of my children, without my wife. They're because they've been spoon fed most of the marriage. And that's not,
that's just traditional.
That's just traditional. And it's also a disservice to men. It's not a slam to men. It's just the way society's been set up. So I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift depending on the movie that you're watching. But in true horror fashion, it's also really fun to watch the psycho moms.
Yeah,
like I wouldn't want that to go away entirely.
No, absolutely not.
And I think that we see even more of like this a whole other trope when we look at a movie like Hereditary.
Yeah.
Where the definition of motherhood is kind of all over. I mean,
she's menacing in her own way.
She's menacing in her own way. She's traumatized in her own way.
She loses it.
And she loses her flipping mind.
Yeah. Then traumatizes everyone.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that in some ways mothers in horror have evolved, but it's kind of fun to make mom a little bit of a demon.
Yeah, I think it's part of what we try to acknowledge and talk about on the regular is like why those things of why we watch horror and expunging your own demons and all of that. You're a primary caregiver. That is an extremely important relationship. And it is credited with all kinds of the developmental and attachment and all the things that happen in early childhood is about that relationship. And so we're talking about it as far as quote unquote mothers today because of the iconic historical nature of what mother means. It's so impactful, and it's such a fantastic way to watch these different kinds of movies, these different kinds of mothers, and from a horror perspective, be simultaneously scared and also drawn towards a mother in a movie. Now, if that doesn't totally, encapsulate what the mother-daughter or mother-son or mother whoever relationship is, I don't know what does. Because as kids, your primary caregiver is usually the person who does your disciplinary tasks, who cooks your dinner maybe, who takes care of you, who goes to the school to pick you up when you're sick. All the things that a primary caregiver does, you are both scared of them and respectful and healthily scared of them or intimidated by them. We're talking about the good enough mother now. And you are also like drawn to need them, all the nurturing. So that dialectic of mother is something we're all working out all the time, even if you didn't have a mother. Even if you had a mother briefly and they went away, or you had a mother like Kathy was saying, and that mother was distant emotionally, physically present, but distant emotionally. Just like fathers are important in that way too. And again, I'm also talking about a primary caregiver and traditionally a secondary caregiver if you had a two-parent home, because the secondary caregiver, whether they're male or female or non-binary or gender fluid, that secondary person has a lot of similar qualities to the like old school traditional quote unquote 1950s father in that they take a second seat to the caregiving. Mm-hmm. They might be the person that's in the workplace all the time. They might be the person that is just emotionally less involved in your day-to-day caregiving.
Yeah, and I think like while you're saying all that, what also comes up for me is there's just this, maybe it's subconscious, maybe not totally unconscious, horrific fear of a mother not being able to do what a child needs them to do. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's because of grief. Maybe that's because of trauma. Maybe that's because of mental illness. So really like behind all these horror movies is a mother who isn't good enough and isn't able to do, and that's terrifying. That's psychologically annihilating.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And we can take something as kind of common as a mother with depression or anxiety, which is fairly common in our world to have some form or some level of depression and anxiety. We use those words very colloquial these days, but if they actually meet the criteria for those diagnoses, it means intermittent caregiving, because with depression, it's going to come and go. With anxiety, it's going to come and go. So sometimes the chaos of your primary caregiver pushing in and being a good enough mother and then pushing out and not being there at all except physically, that is chaotic and crazy for a young person. And to be able to mythologize that into horror and make it that the mother is forward facing, loving, and then like in Hereditary, through grief and a depressive process and then some psychosis, becomes an altogether I'm out of it mom. Mm-hmm. And in a big movie horror kind of way, it allows us as the audience to navigate what that might feel like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they're powerful films. I mean, there's a reason why they continue to be made.
Absolutely.
It's definitely its own subgenre of horror.
And for fun, I love Loomis because I love Laurie Metcalf
she's great
in Scream
she's
2.
so flippin' crazy.
And I loved Piper Laurie in Carrie, even though she was much, much scarier than some of the other mothers we're talking about. But she was really terrifying and such an amazing performance. And then like I would go towards Beverly Sutphin or whatever her name is in Serial Mom, played by Kathleen Turner.
Love her.
Like it's a funny ass movie. And that's a mom that's like a good enough mom, but she happens to be a serial killer. Like she's like baking the
actually
apple
protecting
pies.
her kids from that knowledge.
She's baking the apple pies, and she's like a sweetie, honey, I'm taking care of you kind of mom. Meanwhile, I don't know if you have some other of your favorite.
Well, I thought maybe we would quiz you on a few.
Okay.
You want to do that?
Are we doing the...
Yeah, we're doing it. Horror Facts with Mom!
Oh, God.
All right, so Shannon needs to guess who is the mother? Number 1. Which horror mother had a son named Jamie when she was young and worked as an unknown chorus girl on Broadway? The death of her son made her decide she wouldn't get close to anyone again, but at age 20, she had a daughter.
Black Swan?
Chris McNeil, The Exorcist.
Oh, nice.
Number 2. This sweet horror mama was a New York ballet dancer whose radiance turned into paranoia and horror.
Black Swan.
Rosemary Woodhouse. Rosemary's Baby. Number 3. This mother is saturated with envy, unfulfilled ambition, posing as a mother who selflessly left her career to secure her daughter's future. She is confined to a memory that only exists in her home, envious of her daughter's independence and visibility to the outside world.
I don't know.
Black Swan!
There you go. I wasn't going to say it again.
Erica Sayers.
I knew you were going to say that.
Barbara Hershey.
I'm like, great. I'm not saying it again.
Number 4, this mother is a fictional counterpart to Augusta Gain, Ed Gain's mother.
Oh.
Norma Bates.
Oh, sure.
From Psycho. And then lastly, this mother eliminates individuals she deems as a threat to her family's happiness, and an all-American parent, a great cook, a homemaker, and devoted recycler.
Serial killer.
Yeah. Yes.
Beverly Sutphin.
That's
from
right.
Serial Mom.
Correct. Kathleen Turner was so good in that.
She is so funny in that.
You asked me, though, before we played this fun little ditty of a game.
Black Swan!
Black Swan! That I would agree with you that Kathleen Turner is certainly one of my favorites. I already said that Chris McNeil is another one that I really loved. Mm-hmm. You know, I hated Erica Sayers in Black Swan, but I thought Barbara Hershey's performance was so terrifying and so good.
Well, and you do learn of like her trauma
Yes.
and where it's coming from. So I did actually have some empathy for the character.
I did too.
While simultaneously hating her guts.
If I were to go old school slasher,
Yeah.
there's a movie that came out called Mother's Day,
Yes.
right?
Classic.
1980 or something. Yeah, 1980. This mother is, I mean, it's an awful movie because essentially she like grooms her sons to like rape women. And,
Yeah, it's
and
terrible.
It's awful.
Yeah.
But she does a really good job playing the menacing mother in
Completely
this.
sadistic.
It's a really fucking sick movie.
Yes.
But if you can just kind of go with like how bizarre and awful and crazy it is, like she's terrifying, and she's that mother that's like, my sons are perfect.
Well, and maybe because it's old and dated, that can take you out of it, out of the grossness of it a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. Beatrice Pons plays mother, and she's off her rocker. In fact, she's sitting like she's sitting in a chair, not a rocker on the thing. But this trope is the mother who enables her sons by giving them too much, right? Like, you do no wrong in my eyes. That sort of has an internalized sense of misogyny. and kind of primes her sons to be predators and misogynists and all these things, and kind of lives through that. So she's a misogynist. So in that way, it's triggering, which is why it makes a really good horror film.
Right.
Yeah.
I would add two slightly more contemporary mothers to my list, because the other ones were kind of older things.
Yeah.
Is Ellie from Evil Dead Rise.
Oh, she's so good.
Her performance is amazing, and she's so scary. And I think it, like, mythologically or like movie mythology, working our shit out, it's like this mother that is one way and then is possessed and never to return, basically, to the good mother. Yeah. And so it's that
very scary for
abandonment in the moment, abandonment when someone's still present, and having to rectify what to do, and those kids ultimately don't do very well. But Alyssa Sutherland plays that part so great, and it's a really fun movie. I
love that
to
movie.
Begin with, but
I love that movie. But I agree. I mean, how scary for a child, and we know of cases where something will happen all of a sudden. There's a change. Maybe a parent gets arrested, or there's a change in personality because of an illness or something, and the child has to mourn that.
Yeah,
and that's terrifying.
The other one I would add would be Mutter from Good Night, Mommy, which is an Austrian film, and Mutter with two T's is actually, I think, German for mother. And the mother in that is, I mean, this is a very creepy, dread-inducing, slow burn horror, as a lot of things from that part of Europe are, honestly. And that mom in that, her terrifyingness has to do a lot with sort of plot points along the way and stuff, so I won't ruin anything, but I don't know. That one creeps me out quite a bit. Maybe that's a personal thing, but
and even
that
just
mother creeps me out.
Everything in the whole ambiance of
the whole
film.
movie's creepy. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, all you have to do is look at the poster for that film, and you're like, okay.
I don't think so. No, thank you.
Yeah. So,
all right. Well, happy Mother's Day.
Yeah.
To all the mothers of all things that are living.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a hard job.
It certainly is. And we appreciate the horror movies that help us work through all the things. Even like the pregnancy horror movies we've been talking about a lot lately.
Like Prevenge.
Those are mother movies, right? They're just fetuses.
That's right.
All right. Thanks so much for listening, you guys. This has been an episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.